The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are simply that, opinions. All are presumed innocent until proven otherwise in a court of law. Sensitive topics are discussed. Discretion is advised.
I'm Vinnie Politan, and welcome to the Court TV podcast. This week, we have an audio edition of our original series, Accomplice to Murder with Vinnie Politan, which looks at cases and verdicts that may not be as clear-cut as originally thought.
This is the Court TV podcast with Vinnie Politan.
Police say the gunman was probably a hitman, someone who wanted to see the doctor dead.
As far as insurance, he's worth a heck of a lot more alive than he is dead.
He said, just wait here until my mom calls and tells me that Norm is dead.
This grieving widow is now suddenly the suspect in his murder.
When she looked on Dr. Larzelere's face that day before his murder, she looked in the anticipation of his violent death.
Virginia was confident that she would be found not guilty.
The Larzeleres seem to have it all. 4 kids, a thriving business, a beautiful estate with a swimming pool and tennis courts. But then, greed planted the seeds of a brutal murder that would tear this family apart. And now what's behind me is all that's left of a place they once called home.
Virginia and Norman Larzelere lived in an upscale suburb outside of Edgewater, Florida.
Edgewater is over on the East Coast. It's a little suburb of Daytona Beach. Very small, kind of sleepy town.
Virginia was a single mother with 2 kids when she met Norman at the dental practice he owned.
Norman Larzelere was a successful dentist. He had a practice in Edgewater. He was married himself. One day, this striking woman enters his dental practice for a dentist appointment, and he talks to her, and they start flirting. And from that point on, he was smitten with this striking woman. And not long after that, he left his wife to be with Virginia Larzelere. And they were married, I believe, less than a year after they met.
They also had 4 children between them. Virginia brought 2 of those children from a previous marriage, and they had 2 together. Virginia's oldest son from her previous marriage, Jason, was adopted by Norman, her husband.
I think there were indications really from the start with Virginia's oldest son that he was troubled and he needed a father figure. Norman stepped up and tried to do the best he could do under difficult circumstances.
Behind me is the building where Dr. Norman Larzelere ran his successful dental practice. It's also where he was brutally murdered by a masked gunman armed with a shotgun.
1 p.m. on March 8, 1991, was like any normal day for the Larzeleres. Virginia was at her desk in the front office, while Norman was in the back at a table taking a lunch break. At approximately 1:03 p.m., Norman heard something that caught his attention.
It aroused his curiosity. So he got up from behind the table, looked down the hall, and he was horrified at the sight of someone wearing a ski mask and holding a shotgun.
Norman turned and ran back down the hallway towards a closed door leading into the patient waiting room with the gunman in pursuit.
He bursts through the door, shuts it behind him, and a second or so after that, a shot was fired.
The gunman on the other side of the closed door, to the horror of a dental assistant standing just a few feet away, fired a shotgun blast that penetrated the door and struck Norman in the back. Virginia, who could see what was happening through a window into the waiting room, and a woman sitting in the room, saw Norman hit the floor, mortally wounded.
Virginia called 911. You can sense the terror and the fear in her call to the 911 operator.
What's the problem, ma'am? Wait, what? All right, calm down, ma'am. I need your help. All right, calm down.
Police arrives to this horrific scene, and she is trying to revive him with CPR. She's clearly distraught. She is unable at that point to give them any kind of coherent statement, as one would expect, really, in that situation.
Initially, police had little to go on.
Police have very little on the crime scene other than the typical crime scene evidence of fingerprints of some shotgun pellets that were remnants from the blast.
Virginia led them to a safe that was open. And apparently there was money, coins, and maybe some prescription drugs that were missing.
Initially, police really seemed to go down the road of investigating Virginia's theory. They investigated this as a robbery gone wrong because really it made no sense as anything else. This dentist didn't seem to have any enemies. It was broad daylight. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
While being interviewed by police, Virginia does suggest one potential scenario.
She said, I believe it was a motorcycle gang because I heard a motorcycle speed out of the area at the time.
Edgewater is pretty close to Daytona Beach, and Daytona Beach is a haven for bikers, and biker gangs are known to dwell there.
Virginia's narrative of a robbery gone wrong was picked up by the local news.
Larzelere's wife says the gunman in the office that day was a robber, possibly a patient her husband had treated earlier in the day. Police are not saying whether they think robbery was a motive in the shooting, but neighbors say Larzelere's office has been robbed twice in the last year or so.
After this horrific murder of her husband, Virginia said she was left in fear. She felt she was being stalked. She called police quite often, actually, once reporting a break-in at her house.
But as the weeks pass and no evidence surfaces of any biker gang activity in the area, police take another look at Virginia's story, and a few things just don't add up.
She also told them that she had fought the shooter, that she had fought him off, and she had, in that fight, broken a fingernail.
But other eyewitnesses to the shooting said Virginia never left her desk, staying unnaturally calm until police arrived. Only then, they said, did she become hysterical. Reports start to surface in the media about a large life insurance policy worth millions of dollars that Virginia had taken out on her husband, sparking a wave of media interest.
Two big newspapers covered it day to day. Either the Orlando Sentinel or the Daytona Beach News Journal, or both, wrote a story mostly every day about this case. The local TV news media were all over it.
Police say the gunman was probably a hitman, someone who wanted to see the doctor dead.
Virginia Larzelere was out front. She wanted to make statements. She was willing to speak to the media.
As far as insurance, he's worth a heck of a lot more alive than he is dead. We had too good of a business. With a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old, I'd rather have my husband than all the money in the world.
Now, 6 weeks pass from the time of Norman Larzelere's murder, and that's when there's a huge break in the case. A man named Steve Heidel calls police and says he has some information about the murder that he really needs to report.
Stephen Heidel was a ne'er-do-well type of guy, and he needed money.
He clearly was drawn to them and the possibility of making money off this rich family, and he struck up a friendship with Jason. Steve calls the police and says, I can't live with this any longer. I have to come clean.
When police visited Stephen at his residence to conduct an interview, he told them that Jason Larzelere earlier told him that he killed his father, calling him a wimp for running away from him. Stephen also told investigators where the gun could be found. He led them to Palliser Creek off I-95, where divers recovered a weapon that had been encased in concrete. Stephen had a good incentive to talk. Admitting to helping dispose of the murder weapon made him an accomplice to that murder.
The state knew that in order to obtain incriminating evidence against Virginia Larzelere was that they would have to give Stephen Heidel full immunity for cooperating with law enforcement and providing testimony against Virginia Larzelere.
Armed with that immunity, Stephen also told police there was another accomplice, Kristen Palmieri.
Kristen Palmieri was there. Kristen Palmieri supposedly helped Stephen Heidel put the guns in the cement.
She too worked at Norman's dental practice. Interviewed by police the day of the murder, she told him that she helped Virginia at the office when not attending school, and that she lived with the doctor and Virginia part-time when at school. She just happened to be away from the office when the shooting occurred, returning when the fire and rescue was already at the office.
Chris, if you would, I'd like you to sit right over here.
So he can see me?
Well, there, so there, yeah.
After interviewing Stephen, police called Kristen in for an interview. Kristen almost immediately implicated Jason in the murder of Norman Larzelere.
Jason came out and said it to me once or twice.
What exactly did he say?
In arguments. He said that if he had known that all this was going to happen, that his life wasn't going to go back to normal, that he wouldn't have bumped off Norm for Virginia.
Did you believe him when he told you this? Did you believe that he killed the doctor?
Like I said, I didn't see it. I still don't want to believe it, but...
Now, Kristen Palmieri takes Steve's account one step further. Not only was Jason involved, but she says Jason told her that Virginia was the mastermind.
She had said to me that Jason screwed it up, that he was supposed to be there between 12 and 12:30, and because he was late, she had to fake a robbery or something.
Kristen also told police something shocking about Virginia's actions the day of the murder.
And then she also told me that to cover up his mouth, and because he kept talking, she wanted, I guess, to make it look like she was kissing him or something, but she said she had to smother his mouth to try and make him stop breathing.
With her hand?
No, with her mouth.
Oh, she put her mouth over his mouth so that nobody else could hear him saying that?
Yeah.
But he was saying to her,
yeah.
Why did Jason do that?
Because she said he was saying his name.
For police, this is a complete turnaround in their investigation. These two witnesses have just cracked the case wide open as far as they're concerned. This grieving widow who was cradling her dying husband in that office, trying to revive him with CPR, is now suddenly the suspect in his murder.
Based in large part on the testimony of the two accomplices, Jason and Virginia Larzelere are both arrested and charged with murder in the first degree of Norman Larzelere.
When we return, Virginia Larzelere goes on trial as the mastermind behind the brutal shotgun execution of her husband, Norman.
When she looked on Dr. Larzelere's face that day before his murder, she looked in the anticipation of his violent death, and she looked with the anticipation of money and all the possibilities that that money would bring her.
Virginia Larzelere went on trial in the courthouse behind me as the alleged mastermind behind the brutal murder of her husband. Her son Jason was facing life in prison for being the alleged gunman. But for Virginia, prosecutors wanted death.
If you're prosecuting the person who didn't pull the trigger and seeking the death penalty against this person, and if that person is a woman, that's unusual.
We had the conversations that we're obligated to have.
John Howes and Jack Wilkins represented Virginia Larzelere.
We were told by Virginia no deals. Virginia was confident that she would be found not guilty.
The governor took the extraordinary step of appointing a special prosecutor in this case, and that was Dorothy Sedgwick.
There was a lot of evidence that showed this to be a very aggravated, cold murder for money.
She was undefeated. I mean, she was the Vincent Bugliosi of Central Florida at the time. She had never lost a murder case.
Eventually, Virginia Larzelere's lack of love for her husband and her very real, invigorating lust for money motivated her to use her son, Jason Larzelere, as the gunman.
With her life on the line, Virginia's trial got underway on February 4th, 1992. And while Sedgwick may have been a formidable prosecutor, she had a challenging case to prove.
This was a circumstantial case. That's the bottom line. There wasn't an evidentiary trail linking Virginia and Jason to this crime.
What the prosecution did have, however, was a clear motive for murder.
Virginia had a lot to gain monetarily from her husband's death. There were 7 life insurance policies taken out on his life.
Allstate insurance agent James Armstrong was able to give prosecutors a number showing how much more Norman was worth to Virginia dead than he was alive.
Upon the doctor being murdered, how much would the life insurance policy be worth?
Well, it'd be $1.1 million.
Was this policy in effect at the time of the doctor's death, just 6 or 7 months later, March 8th of 1991?
Yes, it was.
Prosecutors allege that Virginia next went shopping for hitmen so she could get her hands on that money. Ronnie Lee Hayden was an entertainer who met Virginia through his friend Norm.
Do you remember a time when Norm Carn came into the Dixie Belle one night and introduced you to his rich girlfriend from Florida?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember her name?
First name, Virginia.
Did the subject of a brand new Harley Davidson come up when you were talking with Norm and Virginia?
Yes.
How did it come up?
They asked me if there was anything that I wanted. If there was anything I could have, what would it be? And I said a new Harley Davidson.
When you said that a Harley Davidson would be nice, did you say or ask them anything next?
I said, why?
Why what?
Why did they ask me if there was anything I wanted?
What was said next?
Subject come up about murdering your husband.
Okay. And what was said?
I think Norm asked me she wants somebody to murder her husband.
What did you say?
I don't know. I guess we just talked about it.
Okay, did the subject of money come up?
Yes.
Now, did Virginia herself ever say anything about wanting her husband dead?
Yes.
What did she say?
She said she asked me if I knew of anybody that could do it.
Okay, and what did you tell her?
I said, yeah, probably.
Okay. Did you used to live in Florida?
Yes.
Did you say anything about people in Florida?
Yes.
What'd you tell her?
I said around the Miami area, I knew some people that used to do it for $300.
Okay, and was that true?
Yes.
After Ronnie Lee Hayden politely declined to take Virginia up on her offer, prosecutors say she next looked closer to home for a partner in crime.
Now, in the early summer of 1990, around June, July, there was a client in the dental office named Philip Langston. Philip and Virginia strike up a romantic relationship, an affair.
What did Virginia tell you about her relationship with Dr. Larzelere?
That they were separated and getting a divorce.
Was there a time when Virginia Larzelere ever had a conversation with you concerning the murdering of her husband?
Yes, she did.
When and where and under what circumstance did that conversation occur?
She had called me at my house and said they had a big fight or argument. She was in a rage and cursing, and that she had to get rid of Norm. And I told her, that don't look at me. I'm not even capable of anything like that. And then she said, well, do you know anybody? And she said she would pay $50,000. I told her, that she was just mad and that it wasn't something that she really wanted to do. That, she just needed to cool off and think about what she was saying.
Was she more specific in her words about wanting to get rid of Norm?
Well, she said she had to have him killed.
But so far, all that the prosecution had proven was that Virginia had tried but failed to find someone to kill her husband. Next, they allege she looked even closer to home.
The state's case was tied down to, we believe Virginia Larzelere hired a hitman. And when she couldn't find a hitman, she decided to use her son, Jason.
In fact, the state's case that Jason was the shooter and Virginia the mastermind was built on two exceedingly shaky foundations.
She had the words of somewhat sketchy witnesses who had changed their stories multiple times. At the end of the day, the shooter wore a mask. He was not identifiable by facial features, hair color, anything like that.
The prosecution first called an eyewitness who could most credibly argue that the shooter was indeed Jason.
Emma Lombardo is a dental assistant. She works with Dr. Larzelere in his office, and she was unfortunately there the day of the shooting.
What did you see happen? Can you tell us what you saw happen after you first saw the masked, gloved person?
After I saw this man, then all of a sudden I heard, and all of a sudden he fired a shot through the door.
Were you later to tell the police that you recognized the physique of the gunman as looking like someone you knew?
Yes.
And who did you tell the police the physique of the gunman looked like?
It looks like Jason.
She recognized the height and the gait and the mannerisms of Jason Larzelere. There was no question to her that that's who the gunman was.
Virginia Larzelere was on trial here for orchestrating the murder of her husband. Prosecutors allege after she failed to find a hitman to do her dirty work, she turned to her son, Jason, and they say they have a witness who can prove it.
Stephen Heidel was this kind of a strange individual who was just kind of always hanging around the Larzelere home, you know, driving cars, acting kind of like as a valet.
Stephen Heidel was a particularly important witness for the prosecution.
So you really have the testimony of one single witness. Not a perfect witness. He's lied to law enforcement. He's a little shady to begin with. But he's able to connect all the dots for that jury. And that's strong testimony.
The prosecution was particularly interested in Heidel's interaction with Virginia and Jason just after the murder. According to the prosecution, Stephen Heidel was at the Larzelere home when Jason returned around 4:30 p.m. the day of the murder.
What did he say and what was his demeanor as you observed it?
He was very overjoyed and excited, and I was very upset because he was supposed to meet me so much earlier, and I asked him if everything was okay with my mother's car, and he said, yeah, everything's fine. And I told him I wasn't happy about it. I asked him where he had been, and he said, don't worry about it. And when I questioned him further about it, I told him, you know, I wasn't too happy about it, then I was going to leave and go to dinner with Scott. He said, just wait here until my mom calls and tells me that Norm is dead.
What did you do after he made that statement?
I asked him if he was kidding, and he said he wasn't. After I talked to him probably for another 10 minutes, I left the house.
After a few days had passed, he began getting increasingly frequent calls from Virginia and Jason.
I guess they were getting nervous at the time that I had either gone to the police or intended to go to the police at that time. And that was just, like as I said, 2 to 3 days after the fact that they were continually calling me on my car phone, on the beeper, at my house, anywhere I was, and wanting me at the DeLand house, continually in their presence 24 hours a day.
Steve says that from the day after the murder, Virginia ordered him, Chris Palmieri, and Jason to live at her house in an effort to control the narrative, to have them all there. She wanted to be able to control their stories, control what happened next.
And what happened next, says Heidel, was a marathon cover-up of the murder.
From the time I returned to the Larzelere's house in DeLand Saturday till probably either Monday morning or late Monday night, I did not sleep at all. And the times are very vague from being up that long, just sitting at that table going through documents. And she asked everybody to produce either their wallet or purse, and she went through and had a steel charger plate on the dining room table and burnt anything that she thought that should not be in our wallet.
How many days did you stay continuously at the Larzelere house?
Probably 3 consecutive days.
So here's Virginia at her home after the murder with these 3 people who are in her control.
To the best of your recollection, what is it in the words that you recall as specifically as you can? What is it that Virginia Larzelere said to you or anyone else?
Along the lines of, I don't want anything connecting us with any misdoings or wrongdoings or anything like that.
At the top of her list is to get rid of the murder weapon. She tasks Steve and Chris, tells them to wipe down the gun, get rid of fingerprints.
Did you and Kristen Palmieri take the gun, do something with a gun and handgun at Virginia's request?
Yes, we did.
What did you do?
In the master bathroom of the DeLand house, Virginia Larzelere, we encased it in concrete, both the shotgun and the handgun.
Virginia then directed Stephen and Kristen to dispose of the weapons in a nearby creek. Heidel also overheard a conversation directly implicating Virginia as the brains and Jason as the brawn in her plot to murder her husband.
Virginia was complaining that one of the policies for $750,000 she might not be paid on because it had a maturity or a period that had to be in effect for at least 18 months before it was redeemable. And she said it had been less than 18 months, but she'd find a way around it. At that time, Jason was complaining about money and wanting to leave the house because he was not allowed to drive or leave the house at that time. And at that time, Virginia told him to shut up, stop complaining about money, that he would get his $200,000 for taking care of business when everything worked itself out.
When Jason continued to complain, Heidel says Virginia took drastic measures to control her son.
According to Stephen Heidel and Kristen Palmieri, Virginia had Jason drugged up. Jason was out of it for a couple of weeks after this.
Why is it that you say she was making all the decisions? What did you see or hear?
When Jason would often request to leave the house, to be able to do something, to be able to drive his car, she said, "You're not leaving this house, you're gonna stay drugged up and you're gonna stay in that room, so you might as well get used to it."
Through it all, Heidel said that there was only one goal that drove all of Virginia's actions.
Following the funeral, was there a time that you and Virginia Larzelere went to a Red Lobster?
Yes, there was.
Could you tell us concerning the conversation that Virginia Larzelere had with you at the Red Lobster?
Her topic of discussion was still the insurance money, and when she'd be getting it, she said, no one is gonna be getting in the way of me collecting that insurance money. Not you, not Chris, and not even Jason, or they'll wind up just like Norm.
Coming up, the defense takes aim at the prosecution's star witness, Stephen Heidel.
Well, the state says you forget about the 4 perjured statements he gave him. Forget about the fact he lied 4 times under oath, the 5th time he told the truth, because he told the police what they wanted to hear. Virginia Larzelere did.
With Virginia Larzelere facing the death penalty for murdering her husband, the defense strikes back at the heart of the prosecution's case, the credibility and motive of its star witness, Stephen Heidel.
Stephen Heidel, on at least 4 to 5 separate occasions, he gave perjured statements to the police. Perjured because he told them that Virginia Larzelere and Jason had nothing to do with it, that he didn't know anything about it.
The difference in demeanor between the prosecution and the defense could not have been more stark. Jack Wilkins had curly hair and glasses and wore loud suits, and he was very flamboyant. Jack Wilkins' right hand was a man by the name of John Howes. He was very skilled, a veteran defense attorney who had murder trial experience.
Jack called me. I was living in Fort Lauderdale at the time. He was living in Central Florida in Bartow, and asked me if I wanted to get involved in a murder case.
Howes said they built their defense strategy based on long conversations with Virginia.
Virginia was confident that she would be found not guilty. There was no doubt in her mind, and we studiously and repeatedly talked to her and said, listen, There's a contract here for $2.1 million. How do we deal with that issue? Virginia's position was Norm was a loving husband and wanted to make sure that his family was taken care of in case something happened to him.
They began their defense by attacking what prosecutors alleged was Virginia's motive for murder.
Now, the defense tells the jury that the motive here, the money, the $2 million, that makes no sense at all. Why would Virginia, who already enjoys this lavish lifestyle of fancy cars and salon appointments, why would she go after this life insurance money in this way?
Dr. Larzelere was a dentist. He made a tremendous amount of money. Even the state witnesses are going to tell you that Virginia could come into the bank anytime she wants and take up out to $10,000. Just withdraw it, go spend it. She had all the money she wanted. She had all the cars she wanted.
The defense also tried to cast doubt on Emma Lombardo's testimony, identifying Jason as the gunman.
You were afraid that he was going to come back and get you, weren't you?
Yes.
So you were really scared?
Yes.
Things happen real fast?
It happened so quick.
So quick. Do you even know if it was a man or a woman?
My good guess is he is a man.
Your guess is he's a man?
Yes.
But you don't know for sure, do you?
Well, no.
The shooter was masked. For one thing, she didn't see facial characteristics. She didn't see whether it was a man or a woman. And eyewitness testimony is some of the most unreliable evidence you can bring into a courtroom.
To give the jury an alternative option to consider, the defense invites a familiar face into the courtroom.
Our position always was that Stephen Heidel was capable of and able to have done this murder. We actually insisted that when Heidel was on the witness stand, that Jason be brought into the courtroom so the jury could see them standing, facing the jury, same height, same basic body build.
The defense alleged Heidel saw his free ride with the Larzeleres coming to an end.
Virginia had a plan to bring Jason in to live with her and Norm again, and Steve wanted to sort of put a stop to things and keep his hold on Jason. And so defense attorneys claim he took matters into his own hands and that he's no accomplice. He is the killer.
Did you know what Chris was putting in the trunk of her car?
Like I said, I had an idea, but it was wrapped in a towel, so...
Well, when you saw it in the attic, was it wrapped in a towel?
No.
How did he get from the attic to the car?
I went up in the attic and got it.
He had the murder weapon. He left with the murder weapon. He's the one that had it. It was in his house. He had to go into his mother's attic to get it out, to bring it to Virginia.
You also told the police you had nothing to hide, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And that was a lie, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
You told them you had not done anything, didn't you?
Yes.
And that was a lie, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
There is much to attack when it comes to him as a witness.
So you went, 42 days between the time that you talked to the police and told them all the lies we just gone through, and the time that you sat down and told them you wanted to talk to them, right?
Correct.
After 9 days of testimony, both sides made their final pitch to the jury.
Stephen Heidel was not the shooter, that the shooter was Jason Larzelere, that Virginia Larzelere, as she was present in that office on that day, was acting as a principal. And under the law of Florida, she is just as guilty as the shooter.
If you were walking down a dirt road and you came to a fork at the end of that road, and a voice came out of the heavens and says to you, choose the right fork. One will give you eternal happiness and the other one will give you eternal damnation. And you see a guy and a girl standing right there and you say, are you guys local? And they say, sure. And they say, which one do we choose? Which fork do I choose? And they say, take the right fork, Jack. And I say, okay, by the way, what's your name? And he says, my name is Steve Heidel. And she says, my name is Chris Palmieri. Would you take the right fork? Beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. Thank you.
The jury had retired to deliberate after hearing nearly 2 weeks of testimony, but it would only take a fraction of that time for them to return with a verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree as charged in the indictment. So say we all, Daytona Beach, Florida, dated this 24th day of February 1992.
After only an hour of deliberations, the jury came back with a guilty verdict.
We didn't want Virginia to ever be in a position where she could hurt anybody ever again. And I feel much more hopeful now that she won't ever be able to.
How do you feel at this point? You've been working on this case for a really long time.
I'm extremely disappointed, obviously. I felt that it was going to be the other verdict.
I was both disappointed and surprised because she didn't do it. She did not kill her husband.
Up next, the jury decides whether Virginia Larzelere will live or she will die. Virginia Larzelere had been found guilty of murdering her husband to cash in on a $2 million life insurance policy. For her actions, prosecutors wanted her put to death.
For the prosecution, the reason why Virginia's life should be forfeit was simple.
Virginia Larzelere was so cold that she was willing to use her own son to carry out the murder. There is absolutely no reason for the weight to not support a sentence of death for this cold, calculated execution-style murder of Dr. Norman Larzelere.
As of this evening, this case is in your hand as far as your recommendation is concerned. I do hope that you find that even though you found the evidence sufficient to return a verdict of guilty, that the evidence itself does not establish a need for imposing the ultimate sanction in this particular case. And I urge you to return a recommendation for life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Thank you for your attention.
For their part, the defense chose not to put on any witnesses to argue to the jury that Virginia's life should be spared.
Virginia was adamant and steadfast in her claim of innocence. At the time of the jury recommendation, she expected to win.
The jury returned to the courtroom just 2.5 hours later. In Florida at the time, jurors' faces could be shown on television, and it would take only a majority of its 12 members to determine if Virginia should be executed for hiring her son to murder her husband.
Thank you, Susie.
As Norman, I'll address you. Has your jury arrived at an advisory verdict as defendant? Yes. All right, and you would hand the advisory verdict form to the bailiff. The verdict appears to be in proper form. Will the defendants please rise and hearken to the verdict?
In the Circuit Court, 7th Judicial Circuit in and for Volusia County, Florida. Case number 91-2561. State of Florida versus Virginia Gail Larzelere. Sentencing recommendation. We, the jury, find as follows as to the defendant, Virginia Gail Larzelere, in this case. A majority of the jury, by a vote of 7-5, advise and recommend to the court that it impose the death penalty upon Virginia Gail Larzelere.
For a woman to get the death penalty in a case like this, where she was not the culprit herself, she didn't pull the trigger in the murder, is pretty unusual.
In the end, jurors were convinced she was a cold-blooded killer, and the mitigators just weren't enough.
Were you surprised by the jury's recommendation?
I've been surprised about everything about this case. I'm surprised that there was a guilty verdict. I'm surprised with the jury's recommendation of death.
As Virginia Larzelere headed to death row, the trial of her son Jason, who prosecutors alleged was the trigger man in the murder of Norman Larzelere, was about to begin.
You have to remember, in Jason's mother's case, the jury took only 1 hour to convict her and 2.5 hours to send her to death row. The expectation in Jason's case was certainly a conviction.
But the defense put up a fight, casting doubt on why Jason would want his stepfather dead.
He was able to establish that Jason loved and was devoted to Norman Larzelere.
The defense's most compelling argument, however, was that there was no way the jury could be entirely certain the masked gunman was Jason.
The defense attorney challenged the conclusion from the eyewitness who said that was Jason. He asked her, well, how do you know it's Jason? Because he was covered from head to toe.
But still, when the jury returned with a verdict, their judgment caught everyone off guard.
When that not guilty verdict was read in the courtroom, there was silence. This came as a real shock, both to the families and the community.
People couldn't believe it. People were really blindsided by that. It didn't get noisy until after the courtroom was emptied and Jason got into a squad car and yelled out the window saying, "I'm free." That was something that people noticed, and that was another memory that people will take away from that they'll never forget.
Virginia Larzelere spent more than 15 years on death row for being the mastermind behind her husband's death.
Virginia appealed her sentence up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but was denied. Then, in 2003, the State Circuit Court ruled that there was enough evidence that her lawyer, Jack Wilkins, had given her ineffective counsel and overturned her death sentence. Dave Hendry represented Virginia during resentencing.
I had never seen the type of misconduct on the part of a defense attorney and represent a capital defendant ever.
An investigation into her defense lawyer's behavior during trial turned up multiple allegations of alcohol and drug abuse.
It doesn't get any worse than the allegations and the evidence against Jack Wilkins that we obtained in post-conviction.
He's not preparing for his closing argument. He's answering a bar complaint on his financial misdealings. He's destroying financial records when subpoenaed by the government. He's running out of his office with this giant bottle of vodka mid-afternoon, and he's snorting cocaine off of a strip club toilet seat pre-trial.
That ultimately resulted in her being removed from death row, and now she's serving a life sentence.
As for Virginia's son, Jason, after being found not guilty, he struggled to recover from the impact of his trial for murder.
Now, after his acquittal, Jason's biological father took him in. It seemed like they rekindled their relationship. Jason joined the Navy for a while, but it seemed like trouble continued to follow him around. He had run-ins with law enforcement. He seemed to have continued mental health problems, potentially because of this case.
Virginia remains incarcerated at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida.
She's now serving a life sentence, and she is eligible for parole when she turns 81.
That's all for this week. For more Court TV original productions, check out the show notes where you can find links to stream them all for free on the Court TV website. And you can see me on my shows, Closing Arguments with Vinnie Politan, every weeknight at 8 p.m. Eastern, and Vinnie Politan Investigates at 9 p.m. Eastern. Thank you so much for downloading, and as always, please don't forget to hug the kids.
This podcast is a production of Court TV. Go to CourtTV.com for more content, trials on demand, and to find out how to watch Court TV in your area.